9066. And to get into some historical context, so between 1861 and 1940, approximately 275,000 Japanese immigrated to Hawaii and the mainland United States. Many worked in Hawaiian sugarcane fields as contract laborers, and after their labor contracts expired, many remained in Hawaii. They opened up shops, small businesses, and others settled on the West Coast. And as with many immigrant groups, Japanese Americans settled in ethnic neighborhoods and established their own schools, churches, and institutions. So with envy over the Japanese economic success, combined with long-standing anti-Asian racism from white Americans, it led to a disaster for the Japanese Americans when the Empire of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And here I have a picture of the attack. So with the start of World War II, Japanese were no longer trusted or seen as allies. Lobbyists pressured Congress and the president to remove persons of Japanese descent from the West Coast, both Issei, which are the first generation of Japanese in the United States, and the Nisei, which are the second generation of Japanese in America, who were US citizens by birthright. So eventually on February 19th, 1942, 1 year after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, authorizing Japanese exclusion. And on March 21st, 1942, Congress implemented the order by passing Law 503. So the WDC, or the Western Defense Command, began involuntarily removing and detaining West Coast residents of Japanese ancestry. And within 6 months, over 100,000 men and women and children were moved to internment camps, in which 70,000 of them were American citizens. And in addition to this, 101 orphan children of Japanese descent were taken from orphanages or foster homes and were subject to the executive order. So the 10 relocation sites were in remote areas in 7 different states across the US. And I wasn't originally going to include all of the names of the internment camps, but I thought it would be interesting to see if any of you guys have heard of or have lived near these places. And I'm from California, and when I was researching the location sites, I recognized one of the California camps, and I never knew it used to be one of the Japanese internment camps. So the 10 location sites were Heart Mountain in Wyoming, which we saw in the video on Thursday, Tule Lake and Manzanar in California, Minidoka in Idaho, Jerome and Rower in Arkansas, Topaz in Utah, Poston and Guya River in Arizona, and Grenada in Colorado. And I have a quote really quick that I wanted to include. It says, "The internment is considered to have resulted more from racism than from any security risk posed by Japanese Americans." And I just want to include this real quick because it is true that the majority of Japanese living in America were just trying to live the American dream. And we're not really a threat to our country whatsoever, yet they suffered the consequences anyways. So now I want to talk about the internment camps themselves. So the houses were made out of tar, paper-covered, simple frame barracks that had no form of plumbing or cooking facilities of any kind. Living situations were cramped with 25 individuals living in a house meant for 4, making privacy in these homes basically non-existent. And violence was also not unusual, as anyone who attempted to walk outside the fences were shot by guards. There were 30,000 children held in the camps, which led to educational facilities being set up. But due to insufficient funds and little planning, schoolhouses were crowded, there were no books or school supplies, and all lessons were taught in English. And the so-called schoolhouses were essentially prison blocks with 1 or 2 windows. They also held baseball and football teams that were created inside the camps for both men and women. And as we saw in the documentary on Thursday, many also joined music groups. And during the height of World War II, the government sought out volunteers from the internment camps to serve in the US Armed Forces, and about 20,000 men and women eventually served the US Army. And others who did not join the Army eventually lost hope of ever leaving and returning home. So it's not like the government said, you'll be in here for X amount of years. As far as they knew, they were going to be in the camps indefinitely.
How many of you have heard of the Executive Order 9066 prior to taking this class?
I think what stands out for me is that the justification of like time of war was what allowed the executive order to be created against citizens of the United States. I also think that it's interesting that there was no laws leading up to the executive order. It
Mhm,
seems like it was a very quick and rash decision to
mhm,
go from nothing to an executive order all of a sudden.
mhm. Now, it's interesting because the Executive Order 9066 gave permission to War Relocation Authority or the Department of Defense the power to do whatever was necessary to secure the West Coast war zone. And it was the Secretary of Defense through War Relocation Authority who established a series of orders, military proclamations. And these included the curfew order, the evacuation order, and finally the internment order, right? So the Executive Order 9066 did not specify that Japanese Americans needed to be interned. What it did was to empower the Secretary of Defense through the War Relocation Authority the power to do whatever was necessary to secure the war zone area. And they decided to issue those military proclamations. So it was the military that was determining what was necessary. And so they decided that it would be Japanese Americans only who needed to be moved out of their homes on the West Coast and then eventually intern to the other places. In some places like Tule Lake concentration or internment camp, it was still within the state of California, right? There were other internment camp locations outside of California, but the fact that there was still an internment camp within the state of California really raises an important question as to what was the security threat during that time period. And I have a second question pertaining to why Japanese Americans were singled out because we were at war with other countries as well. It wasn't just with Japan, but we were also at war with Germany and Italy as well. Some people may argue, well, possibly because it was the Japanese imperial army that attacked the United States that we decided to single out the Japanese citizens or Japanese Americans. And our government's failure to distinguish between the first generation, the second generation, or the third generation Americans of Japanese descent that eventually led to the internment of Japanese Americans. The question is if, say, for instance, it was Germany that decided to, or the Nazis that decided to attack Pearl Harbor or any part of the United States, I wonder if we would have come up with a similar kind of plan to intern German Americans during that time period or Italian Americans. The question is, do you think that race mattered in our decision to intern Japanese Americans during that time period?
I kind of think that it did, just because the previous century and a half, the United States had been trying to restrict Asian immigration and Asian American, I guess, advancement in the country. And I feel like this was another extension of that. It seems to me that by interning Japanese Americans, the United States and the West Coast was able to profit off of their loss of their land, the loss of their belongings.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, it could be interpreted just as another one of those laws, like the Gentleman's Agreement or, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It could just be a temporary exclusion of Japanese Americans in society, taking away their presence and taking away their land and such like that.
Yeah, so there were ulterior motives from some segments of American society, and they sought to benefit from the internment of Japanese Americans. We cannot discount that fact either, right?
I think one thing that really surprised me was, the government put in a lot of effort in interning these Japanese Americans. And like you said, it was the military that was putting down these orders. Yet when they needed more people to fight, they were taking volunteers from the internment camps to join the US Army to fight in World War II. So, like, I don't know, it kind of seems contradicting to me that they would go through all this effort to intern them, but they're like, we actually need your help in this war.
That's pretty ironic, isn't it? You're asking young men and women, from the Japanese American communities that have already been interned. The War Relocation Authority and the Department of Defense turns around and says that you are draft eligible, and if you would be willing to serve in the US Armed Forces, to fight for exactly what? You may be asking yourself that very question as to what exactly am I supposed to fight for? Am I supposed to fight to defend democracy that does not apply to our families? And there are incredible contradictions in the way the US federal government and the Department of Defense went about interning the Japanese Americans and turning around and asking the men and women to fight in this war, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about these contradictions as well.
So, a little bit of background. World War II began on September 1st, 1939. Japan joined the war on September of 1940 after signing the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. And what this pact did is that it recognized, each respective country recognized that they were the ones in power, and that if one country needed help, that the other two would sort of jump in and support the other country. Then the United States joined the war on December 8, 1941, a day after Japan decided to attack the United States. And then that's a little bit of propaganda. Selective Service Form 304A is what the form was called originally. And then again, a little bit more background. So on December 7th, 1949, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, destroying 18 ships and killing 2,500 soldiers. And then the United States declared war the very next day. So in 1943, the War Relocation Authority and the War Department created a questionnaire for Japanese immigrants to prove their loyalty to the United States. It also served as a form of recruitment for second-generation Japanese Americans. Originally, the form was created to determine the loyalty of second-generation Japanese Americans if they were to join the naval forces. Executive order was signed, Executive Order 9066. But these two questions were very relevant to the, loyalty of Japanese Americans. The question 28 was really, a lot of people saw it as like, if I answer yes to this question, it's like volunteering to serve in the war. A lot of the times this executive order was used as, okay, if you agree with all of these, then you have no problem serving for the US Army in the war. And it allowed military commanders to relocate any individuals deemed a threat to the West Coast. The executive order 13769, signed by Donald Trump, the one that we were talking about, the Muslim ban, was very similar to something that the Japanese Americans had experienced. Again, mentioned prior, 9/11, there's a lot of negative connotation with Muslim Americans in the country. And because of this, this executive order was signed. It banned traveling rights to citizens of 7 predominantly Muslim countries for 90 days. It banned Syrian refugees in a time where a lot of refugees from Syria were seeking asylum from various countries, and the refusal of entry of any other refugees for 120 days. And this was all signed in 2017.
Was there a lot of people, when they answered the questionnaire, did they like kind of avoid the 2 questions? And was that used like against them? Was that the significance of the questions?
Yeah, so there was a bit of, there was some people that answered no to those questions as a form of protest and saying like, I have no allegiance to the Imperial Japanese Empire, and I've always been an American, and I don't see why I need to denounce this empire when I was never. There was some people that answered no, and they were already in internment camps, but yeah, they just felt that they didn't need to do such thing.
So what's interesting about all of this is the timing of the events that happened. So when the bombing of the Pearl Harbor happened, through Executive Order 9066. At the time of issuing the Executive Order 9066, the US government decided to classify all Japanese Americans, whether or not you were a citizen of the United States or you still held Japanese passport and citizenship, all Japanese Americans were classified as enemy aliens. And that's a 4C category. They were referred to as the enemy aliens, right? Even those who were born in the United States. And then shortly thereafter, when it was realized that we needed more troops to fight in the war, President Roosevelt decided to reclassify Japanese Americans, the American citizens, those who were born on American soil, as draft eligible. And then after the internment, during the internment, the US Department of Defense decided to send military personnel into the internment camps, knock on their doors, and ask them to fight in the war. And a lot of these questionnaires were being circulated during that time period in order to test their loyalty to American government. And the question number 27 basically says, are you willing to fight in the war for the United States, right? Wherever they are ordered to fight. Some people, right, not the majority of the people, but in a very small fraction of Japanese Americans during that time period said yes to the question 27. But there were some who said, how can you ask me to fight in this war when you are locking my family behind barbed wire, right? What exactly am I going to fight for? Am I going to fight to defend American democracy that does not seem to apply in this specific case to our family members? And the second question, the question number 28, the operative word there was forswearing any loyalty to the Japanese emperor. And a lot of people had questions or issues with the word forswear. Does anyone know what forswear means?
Agree to give up or do without something.
It means to giving up something, giving up loyalty to the Japanese emperor. So a lot of the second generation Japanese Americans read that question and said, this is a tricky question because I never had any loyalty to give up, because they had no loyalty to the Japanese emperor, previously. So they had nothing to give up. How can you give up something that you don't have? So some of the Japanese Americans felt that this was really a tricky question, and it did not really apply to the American-born Japanese Americans who had no loyalty to the Japanese emperor. Few hundred of Japanese Americans out of tens of thousands of American-born Japanese Americans decided to say no and no to questions number 27 and 28, and became what is known as the no-no boys. They became no-no boys, and they were subjected to all kinds of additional scrutiny because automatically the US government thought that they were disloyal to American government. And so they were sent to places like the Tule Lake internment camp, where their loyalty was scrutinized in greater depth. But what is interesting, or important rather, is the fact that great majority of Japanese Americans, with the help of JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, those who were born on American soil, the second generation, the third generation Japanese Americans who sought to assimilate into American society through that particular organization, espoused or strongly supported following the military proclamations and just going along with the military orders rather than making waves, right? And so, great majority, 99%, I would say, of the Japanese Americans who were asked to serve in the US military wherever ordered, they did so through what is known as the Full 42nd Infantry, all Japanese American military unit. Loyalty questions, I think, raised all kinds of contradictions, I think. Questions, in some ways, are relevant in our society today because, we are asking who is really loyal to American society and how can people really demonstrate their loyalty. In the case of the Japanese American internment, some 2/3 of the people that were interned were American citizens who have certain rights as American citizens, don't they? Even as permanent residents, you are protected under the Constitution of the United States. Just because you are not an American citizen does not mean that you do not have any rights. The police officers or the military or the US government, representatives of the city and state and federal governments cannot go to your house whenever they want, conduct themselves in ways that would violate the anti-search and seizure amendment of the Constitution. And this applies to all people that fall within the jurisdiction of the United States, regardless of your citizenship status. What is strikingly, more important in this case is that we have absolutely taken liberty from the American citizens without the due process of law. So even if you commit a heinous crime, you have the right to due process. Not only have the right to due process, but you also have the right to retain your freedom, right? And in this case, 2/3 of American citizens of Japanese descent basically had to give up their freedom without the due process of law, right? And so there were several sort of violations of the American Constitution that I think could have been raised more sort of vociferously during that time period. In the case of, say, for instance, the Muslim ban or zero tolerance policy, people that have not yet entered the United States, they are not necessarily protected by the US Constitution because they are not already here. And so, there are some significant differences in terms of the treatment of Japanese Americans during that time period versus these seemingly discriminatory immigration policies or travel policy, right? It's like an anti-Muslim sort of travel into the United States, not as permanent residents or as immigrants. I wanted to share some slides with you and go through some additional information pertaining to this particular period. And I wanted to focus on the role of images a little bit. I'm kind of curious as to what you may think about some of these images. So, during the wartime period, there's, bound to be a lot of propaganda. And what was really interesting was that there were, racial dimension to the manner in which the Japanese versus other sort of, enemy forces had been portrayed and depicted during that time period. So I want you to take a closer look at this particular drawing. If you could just study for a minute or two and just jot down what you find really interesting about this this depiction, and then we could come back and talk about this a little bit more, right? So I would like to ask you to study this drawing, and we'll talk about it.
I just wanted to kind of like bring it back to what we were mentioning earlier when you had brought up that there was still Germany and Italy that were participating in the Axis powers, and yet we were interning Japanese Americans. And this is kind of like really expressing specifically that notion right here, and that displaying a Japanese face in such a crude manner, and especially including the Nazi flag and making that visible, and placing him next to like a dignified like American representation and just kind of like nastily representing the Japanese culture as well as Japanese Americans, and like just kind of keeping Japanese Americans from prospering in America continually, and doing so through the media again.
At the top, the description reads, "Don't let them carve those faces on our mountains," right? And by our mountains, they're referring to the Mount Rushmore, right? And you're quite right. Even Hitler here looks very much dignified, as opposed to a Japanese, I guess, emperor who is caricatured in such a stereotypically racist way. And what was even more surprising about this drawing was the person who drew it. Can you identify the person who drew this drawing?
Dr. Seuss.
I was floored when I found out that it was Dr. Seuss that drew these kinds of seemingly, I mean, they're pretty, I think they're pretty racist drawings. I don't know how else to explain it. He did not like Japanese whatsoever. I mean, during wartime, there's a lot of propaganda. That's understandable. We don't generally like our enemies. But there was a strikingly sort of contrasting images of Hitler versus the Japanese emperor, which I found it to be really incomprehensible. For these kinds of, and there were other images during that time period that I think sought to dehumanize the Japanese imperial army. I mean, they are understandably, they are our enemies, but I think there are certain effects underlying dehumanization of certain sort of people in terms of race, right? And that has in some ways long-lasting effect on the American psyche. So even after the war is over, a lot of these images still linger in the minds of a lot of people that have been exposed to these kinds of images over and over again during the wartime period, right? And so there were certain other images that I would like to share as well. So down below, this is a drawing by Dr. Seuss, right? And, references to dehumanizing sort of descriptions to refer to the Japanese Americans. In one incident, they are referred to as like little pesky pests. And then in this case, it appears to be like a gorilla, very much sort of non-humanized, who are capable of atrocities around the world. And in this case, this is, again, depicted as monkeys riding on the waves in the Aleutians. And the best way to deal with, in this case, the lice epidemic was officially noted December 7th, 1941, referring to, once again, the Japanese imperial forces as the akin to the lice epidemic. The only way to sort of deal with these kinds of pestilence issue is to exterminate them, whether as gorillas or as this pesky pestilence. The most effective way to deal with them is through extermination. And then when the war was over, when Japanese military surrendered to the US, once again, they became really sort of pacified monkey, right? I mean, again, they were still dehumanized even after the war had ended, right? Even Bugs Bunny during this time period got into portraying Japanese Americans in a racially sort of disturbing way. And it's kind of interesting how, especially when you compare the manner in which Japanese Imperial Army was at that time portrayed versus the Nazis, right? In some instances, Nazis were very much sort of like your neighborhood friend, and they were not depicted or portrayed in such a sort of dehumanizing way as may have been the case with the Japanese Imperial Army. All of these sort of images help to justify the government action in 1942. So shortly after the bombing of the Pearl Harbor, just a couple of months after, President Roosevelt gave the Secretary of War the power to prescribe military areas and determined that the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War or the appropriate military commander may impose in his discretion. So once again, it's important for you to recognize that the Executive Order 9066 from President Roosevelt gave certain members of the Secretary of War the power to impose whatever military proclamations necessary to establish, to secure the area, right? And so all of these sort of orders came under military control. So military ordered a curfew for all enemy aliens and all persons of Japanese ancestry, right? So if you held German citizenship or Italian citizenship or Japanese citizenship, in addition to all Japanese Americans who may have been born in American soil, they were ordered to follow the curfew that was established by the military. And then immediately thereafter, they posted orders for evacuation, right? So this is the second order, the evacuation order, right? And they were instructed to bring their bedding, toilet articles, extra clothing, and utensils. And what was interesting was that they didn't know exactly where they were going to go, right? But they converted many of like horse track races or other sort of public venues like that, turned them into makeshift places to house thousands of Japanese Americans who were ordered to evacuate. And so these evacuees had to sell their possessions, all of their personal possessions, in such haste. And some of the instructions were posted like so in those communities, and there were specific sort of commands as to what they needed to do during that time period. They were sent to the assembly centers initially, where they were given a tag and a number, and then they were sent to, once again, these stockyards, fairgrounds, racetracks, these makeshift sort of housing, temporary housing for Japanese Americans. They were loaded onto many of these military caravans and eventually sent to, and there were obviously neighbors who did not care for the Japanese Americans. And of course, they had to sell their businesses. They were ordered to basically report to these train stations where they were loaded up and sent to the following 10 internment camps. So all of these red dots are internment camps from California to Arkansas. And then all these blue dots are the assembly centers from Washington to Oregon to California and Arizona, right? Just there was one place in Arizona. I would like for you to sort of place yourself in the shoes of Japanese Americans during that time period. Really try to place yourself in their shoes. So all of a sudden, President Roosevelt issues the executive order, giving military authority the power to do whatever it was necessary to secure the West Coast, right? And they issue these military proclamations. In the first proclamation was that after 6 p.m., you are not allowed to roam the streets until the following morning at 6 a.m. So for about 12 to 14 hours, you had to be inside your home. And this applied to all enemy aliens and persons of Japanese ancestry, regardless of whether or not you were second generation or third generation Americans of Japanese descent. I want you to try to sympathize with that kind of experience. And secondly, right, short time after the curfew order was issued, all these families of Japanese Americans, they were asked to pack up everything and sell your possessions. And they were ordered to evacuate their home and go to a nearby racetrack. And all of these things are happening rather quickly. You don't have like months of preparing to sell your personal possessions and properties. But these things are happening fairly quickly. I wonder what must be going through your mind when the military is telling you, okay, you have to sell everything You just can bring a couple of pieces of luggage and please go to these assembly centers. There, they give you a name tag and a number, and you don't know exactly what the future sort of fate holds for you. You don't know exactly what is going to happen to you. In some cases, a few weeks after or months after, they were sent to this, put on this military caravan and, sent to these train stations. They had to sort of board these trains, and then they were sent to the internment camps that they had no idea where they were located. So during the entire process, you must be asking all kinds of questions, right? So if you are in their shoes, what kind of questions, what kind of concerns might you have?
I think I would probably be most concerned about like if I was going to be able to like stay in contact with all of my friends and family, what was going to happen to all of us, where we were going. During the beginning, I would probably be really worried about like, am I taking the right things? Like, am I going to be able to get my possessions back? What's going to happen to like the life that I've created here?
Yeah, you would have to give up all of your life there, right? Including, many of them were farmers. They're no longer able to farm on the land that they probably cared for many, many years. They will have to leave their friends behind. But I think the biggest concern, at least from my vantage point, might have been what's going to happen tomorrow? Where am I going? And what are they going to do to me? This, I think, immense sort of fear of the unknown, right? They don't tell you that you are going to stay in this internment camp for 6 months or a year or any definitive sort of time, and you don't know exactly what's going to happen inside those internment camps. And so there's a lot of sort of unknown, right? There are a lot of questions that are looming large among the Japanese Americans who were not told adequate information about what is going to happen to them. And this fear of the unknown, what might happen tomorrow, I think would certainly drive me crazy. The fact that, they're taking my liberty away, violating, in my mind, all kinds of constitutional rights that I have as an American citizen. Your ethnicity can't be a crime. That's not something that you have, control over. But they're treating it as if that is a crime, just like, Carlos Boson's reflection about how it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. Well, during World War II, it was a crime to be a Japanese in California. I think it raised all kinds of questions about, what rights does our government have in times of national emergency, and how can those rights be balanced with the rights that American citizens have, or even, permanent residents who are protected still under the Constitution of the United States? How do we strike that right balance? Remains to be a very important, I think, issue for us living in the 21st century. And there are a lot of, people who have experienced and raised similar kinds of questions when the US government would pass laws that seem to violate the intrinsic rights of those individuals, whether it be Muslims, whether it be Mexican Americans, or, other minoritized sort of groups in American society. Unfortunately, they've had to ask similar kinds of questions about, do I have any rights as American citizens? Do I have any rights as someone who is lawfully residing in the United States? Because a lot of times the government's reach into the lives of many Americans and other people that are lawfully resident in the United States appears to be a little too much, right? And so, I think that in reflecting upon the Japanese American experience during that time period, I think it's very important for us to recognize that in each sort of phase of the curfew, the evacuation, and the internment experiences, you have to really try to place yourself in the shoes of the Japanese Americans to fully appreciate the contradiction and the fears, all kinds of sort of emotions that they must have gone through during that time period.